Every parent's worst nightmare became 8-year-old Annie Mae's daily reality. She was completely alone in a world that didn't care if she lived or died. When hunger becomes your constant companion and winter winds bite through your only dress, desperation makes you brave in ways that would terrify grown men. Annie Mae stood on the porch of the most dangerous man in Ember Creek, a giant named Jonas Redwood, who hadn't shown kindness to a soul in 3 long years. Folks whispered he could break a man's neck with his bare hands, that his heart had turned to stone after losing everything that mattered. But this little girl with patched shoes and unwavering eyes looked up at him and said 5 words that would change both their lives forever. "Mister, I can cook and clean." What Jonas saw in that moment wasn't just another beggar at his door. It was something that stirred memories he'd buried deep. What could possibly drive a child to the doorstep of Ember Creek's most feared resident? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried dust down Main Street like whispered secrets, swirling around the weathered boots of anyone brave, enough to venture outside in Ember Creek. This wasn't the kind of town that appeared on territorial maps with any pride, just a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled together against the vast Montana wilderness, as if seeking comfort in numbers against the endless sky. The morning sun cast long shadows between the general store, the saloon, and Doc Peterson's modest practice, while the distant mountains stood sentinel over dreams that had grown as dusty as the streets. Jonas Redwood's cabin sat a 1/4 mile beyond the last flickering oil lamp of civilization, where the prairie grass grew tall and the silence stretched unbroken except for the occasional cry of a hawk. 3 years ago, this isolation had been his sanctuary. Now it felt more like a self-imposed prison, though Jonas would never admit such a thing to the ghosts that haunted his dreams. At 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to carry timber, Jonas had the kind of presence that made smaller men step aside without conscious thought. His hands, scarred from years of ranch work and recent bar fights, could gentle a spooked horse or break a man's jaw with equal efficiency. Those same hands now shook slightly as he poured his morning whiskey, the amber liquid catching what little light filtered through his grimy windows. The townspeople of Ember Creek had long memories and active tongues. They remembered when Jonas Redwood had been the most sought-after ranch foreman in 3 counties. A man who could make even the most stubborn cattle behave and turn struggling spreads into profitable enterprises. They remembered his wedding day, when he'd married sweet Helena Morrison in a ceremony that had the whole town talking about true love and second chances. They remembered the way his face had lit up when Helena told him about the baby coming, how he'd started building a crib with his own hands, working by lamplight after long days on the range. But mostly, they remembered the fire. Nobody spoke of it directly anymore, not within Jonas's hearing. The details had been whispered so often they'd taken on the quality of legend, growing more terrible with each telling. Helena had been visiting her sister in the next county when the lightning struck. The wooden house, dry from summer heat, had gone up like kindling. By the time Jonas rode home from the cattle drive, there was nothing left but ashes and the twisted metal frame of the baby crib he'd never finished. Doc Peterson, whose steady hands had delivered half the babies in Ember Creek, still woke some nights thinking about that awful day. He'd been the one to tell Jonas that Helena was gone, along with their unborn son. He'd watched a good man break apart like a snapped rope, all the strength and gentleness twisted into something dark and dangerous. That was when the drinking started. That was when Jonas began settling disputes with his fists instead of his words. That was when he'd taken to living alone at the edge of town, speaking only when necessary, and trusting no one with anything that mattered. Sheriff Murphy, a practical man with graying temples and worry lines, earned through 20 years of keeping the peace, had tried to help in the early days. He'd brought food, offered work, even suggested Jonas might want to talk to the circuit preacher about grief and healing. Jonas had accepted none of it, retreating further into his self-imposed exile until even the sheriff had given up trying. The only person who still made regular visits to Jonas's cabin was Mrs. Brennan, who ran the general store with the efficiency of a field marshal and the heart of a mother hen. She'd bring supplies every few weeks, leaving them on his porch when he refused to answer the door, sometimes adding a jar of her famous preserves or a loaf of fresh bread. She told herself it was Christian charity, but the truth was simpler. She remembered the man Jonas had been and couldn't quite give up hope that he might find his way back. On this particular morning, as Annie Mae approached Jonas's cabin with determination that would have impressed hardened cavalry officers, Mrs. Brennan was arranging canned goods in her store window. She'd seen the small figure walking down Main Street with purpose in every step, and something in the child's bearing had caught her attention. Children in Ember Creek learned early to be cautious, to recognize which adults were safe and which were best avoided. This little girl was walking straight toward danger with the kind of resolve that suggested she had no other choice. Annie Mae Fitzgerald had been 8 years old for exactly 2 months when the fever took her parents. Her father, a former mining engineer turned farmer, had spoken often of opportunities in the territories, of land rich with possibilities and futures bright with promise. Her mother, gentle and practical, had taught Annie to cook and clean and manage a household with skills far beyond her years. They'd been a family that believed in hard work, honest dealing, and the fundamental goodness of people. The fever had taught Annie different lessons. For 6 weeks after burying her parents in the small cemetery behind the church, Annie had survived on the charity of neighbors and the kindness of strangers. But charity in a frontier town was a finite resource, and kindness often came with conditions that made a young girl's skin crawl. She'd learned to sleep in barns and abandoned buildings, to find food where she could, to stay clean despite having nowhere to properly wash. More importantly, she'd learned to read people's faces, to recognize the difference between genuine concern and predatory interest. She'd developed an instinct for danger that kept her alive when other orphan children might have vanished into the wilderness or worse. It was this same instinct that told her Jonas Redwood, for all his fearsome reputation, was not the kind of man who would hurt a child. The townspeople spoke of his violence in terms of bar fights and land disputes, men's business conducted among equals. Never had she heard whispers of cruelty toward the innocent or defenseless. In a world where she'd learned to fear certain kinds of smiles and seemingly generous offers, Jonas's honest brutality felt safer than many alternatives. Annie had observed Jonas from a distance for 3 days before approaching his cabin. She'd watched him split wood with mechanical precision, seen him tend to his few remaining animals with careful attention, noticed the way he avoided eye contact with anyone who happened to pass near his property. What she'd seen was a man who had built walls around himself, not to keep others out necessarily, but to keep his own pain contained. Standing on his porch that morning, a small fist raised to knock on the weathered door, Annie carried everything she owned in the world. The patched dress she wore, a pair of shoes held together more by stubbornness than leather, and her mother's recipe book, water-damaged but still legible. The book was her most precious possession, filled with careful handwriting that documented not just ingredients and cooking times, but family memories and gentle wisdom passed down through generations. When Jonas finally opened the door, Annie saw exactly what she'd expected. A mountain of a man with eyes like winter storms and the kind of stillness that spoke of controlled violence. What surprised her was the flash of recognition in those eyes, as if he saw something in her that he hadn't expected to find. "Mister," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs, "I can cook and clean. I need work, and I heard you might need help." Jonas stared down at her for a long moment, his mind struggling to process this unexpected disruption to his carefully maintained isolation. He'd grown accustomed to being left alone, to the rhythm of days marked only by the position of the sun and the level of whiskey in his bottle. The sight of this small girl, obviously poor but standing with dignity intact, stirred something in him that he'd thought safely buried. "I don't need help," he said finally, his voice rusty from disuse. "And I don't have money to pay wages." Annie had expected this response. She'd rehearsed her arguments during the long walk to his cabin, preparing for rejection while hoping for the slim possibility of acceptance. "I don't need much," she said. "Just a place to sleep and food to eat. I can earn my keep, I promise. My mama taught me to cook real food, not just beans and hardtack. And I know how to clean proper, how to make a place feel like home." The word home hit Jonas like a physical blow. He'd been living in his cabin for 3 years, but it had never felt like anything more than a place to sleep off hangovers and wait for another meaningless day to pass. The walls that had once echoed with Helena's laughter now held only silence and the accumulated dust of neglect. "There's nothing here for you," Jonas said, but his voice lacked conviction. No place for a child. Annie studied his face with the kind of perception that comes from learning to survive on the kindness or cruelty of strangers. She saw the pain he carried, recognized it as something not unlike her own grief, though magnified by years of festering in isolation. "I don't take up much room," she said simply. "And I won't be any trouble." Jonas wanted to close the door, to return to his whiskey and his solitude, to the familiar comfort of his self-imposed exile. But something in Annie's steady gaze reminded him of Helena's quiet strength, of the way his wife had faced challenges with calm determination rather than fear or anger, against his better judgment, against every instinct that told him to protect himself from further pain. Jonas stepped aside and let Annie May enter his cabin. The transformation began immediately. Annie moved through the space with the efficiency of someone much older, taking inventory of what needed to be done without comment or judgment. She found kindling for the fire, located food supplies that Jonas had left largely untouched, and began the process of turning a house back into something resembling a home. As the sun climbed higher over Ember Creek, casting new light through windows that Annie had quietly cleaned, Jonas found himself watching this small girl work with something approaching wonder. He couldn't remember the last time his cabin had felt warm, the last time the smell of cooking food had filled the air, the last time he'd looked forward to anything at all. "One night," he said finally, his voice gruff with emotions he didn't want to name. "You can stay one night, and then we'll figure out what comes next." Annie May smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd managed since her parents died, and Jonas felt something crack in the ice that had formed around his heart. He told himself it was temporary, this momentary softening, but somewhere deep in his chest, a warmth began to spread that he'd thought lost forever. Outside, the wind continued to carry dust and secrets through the streets of Ember Creek, but inside Jonas Redwood's cabin, something new was beginning, something that neither of them quite understood yet, but both desperately needed. Dawn crept across the Montana sky like watercolors bleeding through wet paper, painting the horizon in shades of amber and rose that Jonas hadn't bothered to notice in 3 years. The first thing that registered in his consciousness wasn't the familiar ache in his head from too much whiskey, but the smell of coffee brewing and something that might have been bacon sizzling in a pan. For a moment, confusion clouded his thoughts. He'd grown so accustomed to waking alone, to silence broken only by his own movements, that the gentle sounds of domestic activity seemed to belong to a dream. Then memory returned, the small girl with determined eyes who had knocked on his door yesterday, asking for work with the kind of dignity that belonged to someone much older. Jonas sat up on his narrow cot, running calloused hands through hair that had grown too long, and tried to make sense of what he was hearing. Annie May moved through his kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned not to wake sleeping adults, her bare feet making almost no sound on the wooden floor. "Good morning, Mr. Redwood," she said without turning around when she heard him stirring. "I hope you don't mind that I started breakfast. I found some eggs that were still good and a bit of bacon that just needed the mold cut off." Jonas stared at her small form standing at his stove, her patched dress already stained with grease spots, her hair neatly braided despite having no mirror to work with. She handled the heavy cast-iron skillet with both hands, but her movements were confident and sure. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. Annie glanced over her shoulder, offering him a shy smile. "My mama. She said a woman who can cook will never go hungry, and a woman who can cook well will always have a place in the world." Her expression grew wistful. She had a book of recipes that her grandmother gave her, all written out in careful handwriting. "I saved it when—" She stopped herself, returning her attention to the bacon. Jonas understood the weight of that unfinished sentence. He'd learned to recognize the particular silence that followed loss, the way people edited their words to avoid the sharp edges of grief. "I'd like to see that book sometime," he said quietly. Surprising himself with the offer, Annie's face brightened. "Really? It's got everything in it. How to make bread that rises proper, how to cure meat so it keeps through winter, even how to make medicines from plants you can find growing wild." She flipped the bacon with practiced ease. "Mama always said the recipes were just the beginning. The real cooking happens when you understand what makes food taste like love." The phrase hit Jonas unexpectedly hard. Elena had said something similar once, standing in their kitchen while teaching him to make her grandmother's apple pie. "Food is just fuel," she'd said, laughing as he struggled with the pastry dough. "But cooking is how we show people they matter." Annie served breakfast on the 2 cleanest plates she could find, setting Jonas's portion in front of him with the same care she might have shown an honored guest. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the bacon crispy but not burned, and she'd even managed to find some wild herbs growing near the cabin to season everything with flavors Jonas had forgotten existed. He ate in silence, acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd tasted food, prepared with attention and care. For 3 years, his meals had consisted of whatever required the least effort: cold beans from a can, stale bread, jerky when he remembered to buy it from Mrs. Brennan's store. This simple breakfast felt like a resurrection of senses he'd deliberately numbed. "It's good," he said finally, the words inadequate but genuine. Annie beamed with pride. "Mama always said the secret was in the timing. Most folks cook too fast. Don't let the flavors have time to get acquainted with each other." She took a small bite of her own portion, making it last. She could make a feast out of nothing but potatoes and onions, make it taste like something you'd serve to company. After breakfast, Annie began the process of cleaning with the same methodical approach she'd brought to cooking. She worked quietly, not chattering or asking questions, simply moving through the cabin and restoring order to spaces that had been neglected for far too long. Jonas watched her work with something between amazement and discomfort. Unused to having his private chaos organized by someone else, she found things he'd forgotten he owned, books Helena had loved, a carved wooden box that had belonged to his father, a photograph he'd hidden away because looking at it caused too much pain. Annie handled each discovery with respectful care, neither prying nor judging, simply creating space for his possessions to exist without shame. When she uncovered the photograph, Jonas and Helena on their wedding day, both of them young and radiant with hope, she held it for a long moment before setting it gently on the mantelpiece. "She was beautiful," Annie said simply. "You both look so happy." Jonas stared at the photograph, seeing it clearly for the first time in 3 years. He'd expected the usual surge of pain and anger, but instead felt something gentler, a sweet ache that carried love alongside the loss. "She was," he said quietly, "beautiful and kind and too good for a man like me." Annie considered this with the seriousness she brought to most adult conversations. "My mama used to say that when people love us, they see things in us that we can't see ourselves. Maybe your Helena saw exactly what kind of man you really were." The wisdom in her words, spoken with such casual certainty, left Jonas momentarily speechless. This child, who had lost as much as he had, somehow maintained a faith in the fundamental goodness of people that his grief had destroyed. Throughout the morning, Annie shared stories about her mother while she worked. She spoke of learning to braid bread dough while standing on a wooden crate to reach the counter, of gathering wild berries and being taught to identify which plants were safe to eat. Her voice carried the particular cadence of someone preserving precious memories, each story polished smooth by repeated telling. Mama had this way of making everything feel special, Annie said as she swept dust from corners that hadn't been cleaned in months. Even washing dishes became an adventure when she told stories about the people who might have eaten off those same plates before us. She said every object had a history, and it was our job to treat things with respect because we were just borrowing them for a little while. Jonas found himself drawn into her stories despite his usual preference for silence. There was something healing about listening to someone speak of loss without bitterness, of maintaining love for people who were gone without drowning in the absence they'd left behind. "What about your father?" he asked during a moment when Annie paused in her cleaning to rest. Her expression grew thoughtful. Papa was different from Mama, quieter, more serious. He'd been a mining engineer back east before they came out here, knew all about rocks and metals and how to find valuable things hidden in the ground. She resumed sweeping, her movements becoming more vigorous. He taught me to read maps and understand surveys, said knowledge was the only thing nobody could take away from you. Something in her tone suggested there was more to this story, but Jonas didn't press. He was learning that Annie, like himself, carried secrets that would be shared only when she was ready. By midday, the cabin had been transformed. Dust had been banished, surfaces cleaned and organized, and the accumulated neglect of 3 years had been replaced by something approaching domestic comfort. Jonas moved through the space with a mixture of gratitude and unease, uncertain how to exist in a place that suddenly felt more like a home than a hiding place. "I should go," Annie said, as she hung up the dish towel she'd been using. "You said one night, and I don't want to wear out my welcome." The words hit Jonas with unexpected force. Somewhere during the morning, he'd grown accustomed to her presence, to the quiet efficiency with which she moved through his space, to the gentle stories that had filled the silence he'd wrapped around himself like armor. "Where will you go?" he asked, the question emerging before he could stop himself. Annie shrugged with the practiced indifference of someone who had learned not to expect too much from life. "There's always somewhere. Mrs. Brennan at the store said she might have work for me, and Doc Peterson mentioned he could use help organizing his medical supplies." The thought of Annie working for other people, of her gentle presence brightening someone else's life, triggered a reaction in Jonas that surprised him with its intensity. He wanted to claim her somehow, to ensure that her stories and her cooking and her quiet wisdom remained part of his world. "Stay," he said abruptly, the word emerging with more force than he'd intended. "Stay another day or two. There's more work that needs doing," and he struggled to find words that wouldn't reveal too much of his growing attachment. It would be foolish to turn away good help. Annie's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire appearance, erasing the careful composure she usually maintained and revealing the child beneath the premature maturity. "Really? You mean it?" Jonas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He told himself this was practical, that having someone to cook and clean was simply sensible. But the truth was more complicated. For the first time in 3 years, he'd awakened to something other than emptiness, and he wasn't ready to return to the barren landscape of his grief. As the afternoon wore on, Annie produced her mother's recipe book from the small bundle of possessions she carried. The water-damaged pages were filled with careful handwriting in faded ink, recipes interspersed with notes about family history and gentle advice about life and love. "Look here," Annie said, pointing to a page near the middle of the book. "This is for something called comfort stew, Mama's great-grandmother's recipe for when times were hard and you had to make a little meat feed a lot of people." Jonas studied the careful instructions, noting how the recipe had been modified over the years. Additions and changes noted in different hands as each generation adapted it to their own circumstances and resources. She wrote notes in the margins, he observed, Impressed by the thoroughness of the documentation, Mama said recipes were like stories. They got better when people added their own chapters. Annie traced one of the marginal notes with her finger. This one says, "Add extra sage when cooking for someone with a broken heart. It helps the medicine go down easier." The phrase caught Jonas's attention, and he leaned closer to read the faded writing. The idea that food could be medicine, that cooking could be a form of healing, resonated with something deep in his understanding of what Annie had been doing for him all day. As evening approached, and Annie began preparing dinner using ingredients she'd found in his pantry, Jonas realized that his cabin had begun to feel different, warmer somehow, filled with purpose and life in ways he'd thought lost forever. The smell of cooking food, the sound of someone moving through the space with careful attention, the simple pleasure of anticipating a meal prepared with care, all of it combined to create something he hadn't experienced since Helena's death. When Annie served dinner, she set the photograph of Jonas and Helena in a place where the lamplight would catch it, creating the impression that Helena was somehow present for the meal. It was a small gesture, but one that acknowledged the importance of memory while making space for new experiences. "Thank you," Jonas said as they finished eating, the words carrying more weight than a simple acknowledgement of the meal. Annie understood the deeper meaning. "You're welcome, Mr. Redwood. Thank you for letting me stay," as they prepared for another night in the cabin, Annie insisting on sleeping on the floor near the fireplace despite Jonas's offers to give up his bed. Both of them understood that something fundamental had shifted. What had begun as a desperate bargain between strangers was evolving into something neither quite had words for yet. Outside, the wind carried new scents across the prairie, hints of approaching weather, the distant smoke from other homesteads, and perhaps the first suggestion of changes coming to Ember Creek that would test everything they were building together. But inside the cabin, warmth and light held back the darkness, and for the first time in 3 years, Jonas Redwood fell asleep looking forward to tomorrow. 3 days had passed since Annie Mae first knocked on Jonas Redwood's door, and already the rhythm of their shared existence had begun to feel as natural as breathing. Jonas found himself waking earlier, drawn from sleep, not by the harsh demands of a hangover, but by the gentle sounds of Annie preparing breakfast and the anticipation of coffee brewed with care rather than merely consumed out of habit. The transformation of his living space continued with each passing hour. Annie approached the neglected cabin like a master craftsman, restoring a forgotten work of art, revealing beauty and function that had been buried under years of deliberate indifference. She'd found his leather work gloves discarded in a corner, stiff with disuse and crusted with old dirt, and had spent an entire evening working neat's foot oil into the leather until they regained their suppleness. "These are good gloves," she'd said, holding them up to catch the firelight. "The kind that get better with age, if you take care of them proper." Jonas had watched her work with something approaching reverence. Helena had possessed the same instinct for restoration, the same belief that broken things could be made whole again with patience and attention. But where Helena's care had been intuitive and generous, Annie's carried the weight of necessity. She understood the value of maintaining what you had, because replacement might never come. On the 4th morning, Annie served breakfast with a confidence that suggested she'd been managing Jonas's kitchen for years rather than days. The eggs were perfect, the bacon crispy, and she'd even managed to make biscuits using flour she'd discovered in the back of his pantry. "How did you know that flour was still good?" Jonas asked, genuinely curious about her domestic skills. Annie smiled, pleased to share knowledge her mother had passed down. "You smell it first. Bad flour has a sour edge to it. Then you look for bugs or strange colors. That flour was fine, just needed sifting to get the lumps out." She paused in her eating to demonstrate the proper way to test flour with her fingertips. "Mama taught me that most food will tell you what it needs if you pay attention." After breakfast, Jonas surprised both of them by suggesting they work together on the fence that had been slowly collapsing around his property. The posts were solid, but 3 years of Montana weather had loosened the wire and created gaps large enough for wildlife to wander. Through, Annie approached the task, with the same methodical attention she brought to cooking and cleaning. She handed Jonas tools before he asked for them, held wire taut while he secured it to posts, and asked thoughtful questions about the work that showed she was learning rather than simply helping. "Why do you space the posts exactly 8 feet apart?" she asked as they moved down the fence line. "Any closer and you're wasting wood," Jonas explained, finding unexpected pleasure in teaching someone who genuinely wanted to learn. "Any farther and the wire sags too much in winter when the snow weighs it down." Annie nodded seriously, filing the information away with the same care she applied to her mother's recipes. Jonas began to understand that her questions weren't idle curiosity. She was building a foundation of practical knowledge that would serve her throughout her life. As they worked, their conversation meandered through topics that revealed more about both their pasts. Jonas found himself talking about his years as a ranch foreman, the satisfaction of managing large operations and solving problems that combined physical labor with strategic thinking. Annie shared memories of helping her father with surveying work, holding measuring chains and learning to read the landscape for signs of what lay beneath the surface. "Papa always said the earth keeps its secrets, but it leaves clues for people who know how to look," she said, as they paused to rest in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "He could tell you where to dig a well just by studying how the grass grew, or spot or veins by the way rocks were layered in creek beds." Jonas studied Annie's face as she spoke, noting the particular expression that always appeared when she talked about her father, a mixture of pride and loss that he recognized from his own relationship with memory. "Sounds like he was a smart man," Jonas said quietly. "He was. Mama said he could have made a fortune back east, working for the big mining companies. But he wanted to make his own way, build something that belonged to us." Annie picked up a handful of dirt, letting it run through her fingers. "He used to say the best wealth was land you understood, and land that understood you." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jonas instinctively moved closer to Annie, his hand resting on the hammer he'd been using to secure fence posts. Years of living on the frontier had taught him to be cautious about unexpected visitors. Doc Peterson rode into view on his aging mare, his medical bag secured behind his saddle, and his usually cheerful expression tempered with concern. He pulled up near the fence line and dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints had begun to remind him of his age. "Jonas," he said with a nod, then turned his attention to Annie with obvious relief. "And Miss Annie May, I've been worried about you, child." Annie straightened with the formal politeness she reserved for adult authorities. "Good afternoon, Doc Peterson. I'm doing fine, thank you for asking." Doc Peterson's experienced eye took in Annie's appearance, the clean dress, the healthy color in her cheeks, the absence of the pinched expression that had marked her face during her weeks of wandering. His gaze shifted to Jonas, noting changes there as well. Less tension in his shoulders, clearer eyes, the subtle signs of a man who had been sleeping better and drinking less. "I can see that," Doc Peterson said with approval. "You look like someone who's been eating regular meals and sleeping in a real bed." "Mr. Redwood has been very kind," Annie said carefully, aware that her living arrangement might be viewed with suspicion by some townspeople. Doc Peterson studied Jonas for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. As the town's physician, he'd seen Jonas at his worst, drunk, belligerent, and consumed by grief that had curdled into something destructive. The man standing before him now bore little resemblance to that broken figure. "I'm glad to hear it," Doc Peterson said finally. "The town's been talking, of course. Folks noticed the smoke coming from your chimney during daylight hours, saw Annie in your company yesterday when you rode to Mrs. Brennan's store." Jonas felt his defensive instincts rising. "If people have something to say, they can say it to my face." "Most of what they're saying is good," Doc Peterson assured him quickly. "Mrs. Brennan mentioned that Annie was polite and well-mannered, that she helped you select supplies like she knew what she was about. Sheriff Murphy noticed you were sober and civil when you tipped your hat to his wife. The implication was clear. Jonas's behavior had improved dramatically since Annie's arrival, and the townspeople had taken notice. Annie's been a help, Jonas admitted grudgingly, unwilling to reveal the full extent of how much her presence had changed his life. Doc Peterson smiled, understanding far more than Jonas was willing to say. I'm sure she has. And I imagine she's learning quite a bit as well. He turned to Annie. Your father would be proud to see you managing so well, child. He always said you had more sense than most adults. Annie's face brightened at the mention of her father's pride, but Jonas caught the flicker of pain that crossed her expression. He found himself stepping slightly closer to her, a gesture of protection that didn't go unnoticed by Doc Peterson. We should get back to work, Jonas said, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. This fence won't fix itself. Doc Peterson nodded and remounted his horse, but paused before riding away. Jonas, if you don't mind some advice from an old man, what you're doing here is good, for both of you. Don't let fear of what people might think keep you from doing what's right. After Doc Peterson had ridden away, Jonas and Annie returned to their work in thoughtful silence. The conversation had highlighted something they'd both been avoiding. Their arrangement, however beneficial, existed outside normal social conventions. A single man providing shelter for an orphaned girl would inevitably attract attention and speculation. That evening, as Annie prepared dinner, Jonas found himself watching her with new awareness of how precarious their situation really was. Annie had brought light and purpose back into his life, but she was still a child who needed stability and protection that went beyond his ability to provide shelter and food. The thought of losing her, of returning to the emptiness that had defined his existence for 3 years, created a hollow ache in his chest that reminded him uncomfortably of the early days of grief. Annie, he said as they sat down to eat, if anyone asks, you tell them you're earning your keep through honest work. You tell them, I'm teaching you ranch skills that will serve you well wherever you end up. Annie looked up from her plate, her expression serious. Is that what I'm doing? Learning ranch skills so I can work somewhere else? The question caught Jonas off guard. In his mind, he'd been preparing defenses against outside criticism, but he hadn't considered how his words might sound to Annie, like he was already planning for her departure. Jonas struggled to find words that would reassure her, without revealing too much of his own growing attachment. I want you to learn things that will help you, whatever comes next. Annie nodded slowly, but Jonas could see that his answer hadn't entirely satisfied her. She was learning to read his moods and expressions with the same attention she brought to testing flour or timing bacon, and his discomfort was clearly visible to her perceptive eyes. Later that night, as Annie settled into her makeshift bed near the fireplace, Jonas lay on his cot and listened to the quiet sounds of her breathing. For the first time since Helena's death, his cabin felt like a home rather than a refuge. The leather work gloves Annie had restored lay on the table beside his bed, supple and ready for tomorrow's work. But alongside the contentment came worry about Annie's future, about his own capacity to provide the stability she deserved, and about forces beyond his control that might threaten the fragile peace they were building together. Outside, the wind carried new scents across the prairie, and Jonas found himself wondering what changes those scents might herald for Ember Creek and the unlikely family he and Annie were becoming. By the end of Annie's first week at Jonas's cabin, the transformation had become impossible to ignore. Smoke rose steadily from his chimney throughout the day. His windows gleamed clean in the morning sunlight, and neighbors passing on the distant road could catch glimpses of laundry hanging on a line that hadn't been used in 3 years. More telling still was Jonas himself, walking straighter, speaking civilly to the few people he encountered, and displaying none of the barely controlled rage that had defined him since Helena's death. The change hadn't gone unnoticed in Ember Creek, where news traveled faster than wildfire and was often just as consuming. In Mrs. Brennan's general store, Conversations that had once revolved around weather and crop prices now inevitably turned to speculation about Jonas Redwood and his young houseguest. "It's not natural," declared Mrs. Hutchins, a sharp-featured woman whose husband ran the blacksmith shop. "A man like that, living alone with a child. People will talk." Mrs. Brennan, who had been quietly pleased by the reports of Jonas's improved condition, bristled at the implication. "People are already talking, Martha, and most of what they're saying is nonsense. That child needed help, and Jonas provided it. There's nothing unnatural about Christian charity." "Charity," Mrs. Hutchins sniffed. "Seems to me the help is flowing in the other direction. I heard tell his place is cleaner than it's been since his wife died, and he's been seen sober in broad daylight." Sheriff Murphy, who had been selecting supplies for his weekly rounds, paused in his examination of ammunition to listen to the conversation. As the town's lawkeeper, he'd been monitoring the situation with professional interest, ready to intervene if Jonas's newfound stability proved temporary, or if Annie's welfare became a concern. "From what I've observed," Sheriff Murphy said carefully, "both parties seem to be benefiting from the arrangement. The child appears healthy and well cared for, and Jonas has been conducting himself like a civilized man for the first time in years." Mrs. Hutchins pursed her lips disapprovingly. "Mark my words, no good will come of it. Men like Jonas Redwood don't change their spots just because a child shows up on their doorstep." But Mrs. Brennan had seen the changes herself, and her motherly instincts told her something valuable was happening at the isolated cabin. "Maybe," she said firmly, "some men just need a reason to remember who they used to be." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jonas and Annie themselves, their presence creating a momentary hush as the assembled customers studied them with undisguised curiosity. Jonas had taken care with his appearance, wearing a clean shirt and having attempted to tame his unruly hair. Annie walked beside him with quiet dignity, her patched dress clean and her hair neatly braided. "Good morning." "Mrs. Brennan," Annie said politely, offering a slight curtsy that spoke of careful upbringing. "Mr. Redwood and I need some supplies, if you please." Mrs. Brennan's face softened at Annie's formal courtesy. "Of course, dear. What can I help you find?" Annie produced a carefully written list from her pocket, the paper showing signs of much consideration and revision. "We need flour, salt, and some soap if you have any. And Mr. Redwood thought we might look at fabric, if it's not too dear." The mention of fabric caused a stir of interest among the watching women. Fabric meant clothing, and clothing meant Jonas was thinking beyond temporary arrangements. "What kind of fabric were you considering?" Mrs. Brennan asked, genuinely interested in Annie's needs. Annie glanced up at Jonas, clearly seeking permission before speaking. "Something sturdy for everyday wear. My dress is getting too small, and Mr. Redwood says a working person needs proper clothes." Jonas felt the weight of multiple stares as he nodded confirmation. "Child's been making do with what she has. Seems like she should have something that fits." The simple statement carried more weight than Jonas intended. In acknowledging Annie's need for new clothes, he was implicitly claiming responsibility for her future welfare, a commitment that went far beyond temporary charity. Mrs. Brennan led them to her modest selection of fabric, discussing options with Annie in the tone she might have used with any young woman learning to manage a household. The other customers watched this interaction with varying degrees of approval and suspicion, but none dared to comment directly while Jonas was present. As they made their selections and completed their purchases, Annie's natural politeness won over even some of the more skeptical observers. She thanked Mrs. Brennan graciously, held the door for an elderly customer, and addressed Sheriff Murphy with the respect due his position. "She's got nice manners," admitted Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, after Jonas and Annie had left. "Whoever raised her did a good job. Her parents were decent people," Mrs. Brennan confirmed. "The Fitzgeralds were hard-working and honest, even if they were a bit too trusting about some things." The cryptic comment hung in the air, but Mrs. Brennan didn't elaborate. She'd heard rumors about the circumstances surrounding the Fitzgeralds' death, whispers about debts and disputes that had followed them from their previous home. But she kept such speculation to herself. Outside the store, Jonas and Annie loaded their purchases into his wagon while trying to ignore the attention they were attracting. Word of their appearance in town was already spreading, carried by children sent on errands and women conducting their morning shopping. "They're all looking at us," Annie observed quietly, her voice carrying more curiosity than concern. "People in small towns look at anything different," Jonas replied, checking the wagon's load with unnecessary attention. "They'll find something else to occupy their minds soon enough." But even as he spoke, Jonas was aware of how unusual their pairing must appear to observers. He was a man with a reputation for violence and isolation. She was a child who should have been attending school and playing with others her age. The gap between them in age, experience, and social position was vast enough to fuel speculation for months. Their next stop was Doc Peterson's office, where Annie had remembered seeing a small lending library that the doctor maintained for his patients. She'd mentioned wanting to find books that might help her improve her reading, and Jonas had surprised himself by offering to take her there. Doc Peterson greeted them warmly, genuinely pleased to see Annie's continued healthy appearance and Jonas's ongoing sobriety. "Annie, my dear, you're looking well. And Jonas, you seem to be thriving in your new role." "What role is that?" Jonas asked, his defensive instincts stirring. Doc Peterson's eyes twinkled with gentle humor. "Why, the role of teacher, of course. I can see Annie's been learning practical skills, and she mentioned wanting to improve her reading. Education is a noble calling." The doctor's words provided a framework for their relationship that felt both accurate and socially acceptable. Jonas was indeed teaching Annie about fence repair, animal care, and the practical skills needed for frontier life. In return, she was teaching him things he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. How to find joy in simple domestic pleasures, how to appreciate another person's company, how to hope for tomorrow. Annie selected several books from Doc Peterson's collection, choosing stories about pioneers and settlers that reflected her own experience of life on the frontier. As she browsed, Doc Peterson drew Jonas aside for a quiet conversation. "The child seems to be flourishing," he observed. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." Jonas nodded stiffly, uncomfortable with praise he wasn't sure he deserved. "She's a good worker, earns her keep, I'm sure she does." "But Jonas," Doc Peterson's voice grew serious, "there will be questions eventually. About her schooling, her future, the legality of your guardianship. It might be wise to start thinking about how you want to address those concerns." The warning hit Jonas like cold water. In the comfortable routine they'd established, he'd avoided thinking about the larger implications of their arrangement. Annie needed more than just shelter and meals. She needed education, social interaction with children her age, and the security of legal protection. "What would you suggest?" Jonas asked reluctantly. "Talk to Sheriff Murphy about the legal requirements for guardianship. Consider enrolling Annie in school when the new term starts. Most importantly, make sure your own house is in order. No drinking, no fighting, nothing that could be used against you if someone decides to challenge your fitness as a guardian." The conversation continued in practical terms, but Jonas's mind was already racing ahead to potential complications. He'd grown so attached to Annie's presence that the thought of losing her created a physical ache in his chest. But her welfare had to come before his own needs, no matter how much her absence would cost him. When they returned to the cabin that afternoon, Jonas found himself watching Annie with new awareness of how temporary their situation might be. She moved through their shared space with complete confidence, humming softly as she prepared their evening meal, clearly content with their domestic arrangement. That night, Jonas began carving something he hadn't attempted since Helena's death, a small wooden doll, carefully shaped and sanded smooth. His hands remembered the pleasure of creating something beautiful and useful, of taking raw material and transforming it into something that might bring joy to another person. The doll would be a gift for Annie, but it was also something more, a symbol of his commitment to her happiness and a promise that he was learning to build rather than merely survive. As he worked by lamplight, occasionally glancing over at Annie as she practiced her reading by the fireplace, Jonas began to understand that love didn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it crept up quietly, disguised as practical responsibility and mutual benefit. Until one day, you realized you couldn't imagine your life without the other person's presence. Outside, the wind carried new sounds across the prairie, the distant rumble of approaching horses and the faint echo of voices discussing maps and boundaries. But inside the cabin, warmth and light held back more than just the darkness, creating a sanctuary where two damaged souls were slowly learning to trust in the possibility of family. Annie discovered the surveyor's map quite by accident, while cleaning out Jonas's old trunk, searching for blankets that might make her sleeping area more comfortable as the nights grew colder. The map was folded beneath layers of clothing that smelled of cedar and memory, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and time. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard territorial survey, the kind of document that frontier settlers used to establish property boundaries and filing claims. But as Annie spread it across Jonas's kitchen table, her father's training in reading such documents revealed details that made her heart race with recognition and confusion. "Mr. Redwood," she called softly, her voice carrying an odd mixture of excitement and concern. "Could you come look at this, please?" Jonas emerged from the barn where he'd been tending to his few remaining livestock, his hands still dusty from spreading fresh straw. The sight of Annie bent over an unfamiliar document at his table made him pause in the doorway, memory and guilt warring across his expression. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "In your trunk, under the winter clothes. I was looking for extra blankets and—" Annie's words trailed off as she noted the tension that had suddenly appeared in Jonas's shoulders. "I'm sorry if I shouldn't have been looking through your things. I just thought—" "It's all right," Jonas said quickly, moving to stand beside her at the table. "You have as much right to those blankets as anyone. I just haven't looked at that map in a long time." Annie studied his face with the perceptive gaze that had learned to read adult emotions for signs of safety or danger. "Papa taught me to read surveys like this one. He said maps tell stories about the land, about who owns what and why it matters." She traced one of the marked boundaries with her finger. "This shows mineral rights, doesn't it? The symbols here. They mark places where someone found valuable deposits." Jonas stared down at the map, seeing details he'd tried to forget, overlaid with memories that had never fully healed. "Your father was a mining engineer. He would have known about such things. Papa said mineral rights were often more valuable than the land itself, especially if someone found silver or gold." Annie's finger moved to a section of the map that showed Jonas's current property. "According to this, there are silver deposits right here, under your land." The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither fully understood yet. Jonas sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "How much do you know about your parents' death, Annie?" he asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. "They died of fever. Doc Peterson said it was quick, that they didn't suffer much." Jonas shook his head slowly. "That's what everyone believes, and maybe it's kinder to let them think so. But your parents weren't sick when they died, child. They were murdered." The words hit Annie like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. "What do you mean? Who would want to hurt them?" "Men who wanted what your father knew," Jonas said, his voice heavy with old guilt. "Your father and I were partners in a mining venture 3 years ago, before I met Helena. We discovered silver deposits on this land and filed the proper claims. But filing claims and keeping them are two different things when there's serious money involved." Annie stared at him, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed beginning to fall into place. "You knew my papa?" "I knew him well. Thomas Fitzgerald was the best mining engineer I ever worked with, and one of the most honest men I ever met." Jonas's voice grew rough with emotion. "When I decided to marry Helena and settle down to ranching, your father bought out my share of the mining rights. He was going to work the claims himself, use the profits to build a good life for you and your mother. But someone didn't want him to have those profits," Annie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonas nodded grimly. There were men who thought the claim should belong to them, men with more money and fewer scruples than your father. They tried to buy him out at first, offered prices that were far below the true value of the deposits. When he refused, they tried legal challenges, claiming irregularities in the filing process. And when that didn't work, they killed him. Made it look like fever to avoid questions, but I knew better. Your father had sent me a letter just days before he died, telling me about the threats he'd been receiving. He was scared, Annie, but he was also determined to hold on to what was rightfully his. Annie sat heavily in her chair, overwhelmed by the revelation that her parents' death hadn't been a random tragedy, but a deliberate act of greed and violence. Why didn't you do something? Why didn't you help him? The accusation in her voice was like a knife to Jonas's heart. I tried. When I got his letter, I rode out to your family's place as fast as I could. But I was too late. Your parents were already dead and you had vanished. I spent weeks looking for you, asking everyone if they'd seen a little girl who might have survived. I was hiding, Annie said, memory flooding back with painful clarity. Papa told me if anything happened to him and Mama, I should run and hide until it was safe. I stayed in the woods for almost a week before I finally came out. Jonas reached across the table and gently touched her hand. I'm sorry, Annie. I failed your father and I failed you. If I'd been faster, stronger, smarter, you couldn't have saved them, Annie interrupted, her voice gaining strength. Papa always said you can't fight greed with good intentions. But Mr. Redwood, if you and Papa were partners, and he bought your share of the mining rights, what does that mean now that he's gone? Jonas had been dreading this question, knowing it would force him to confront the legal complexities he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Legally, the rights should have passed to you as his heir. But proving that in territorial court, especially with powerful men opposing the claim, would require evidence and resources that we don't have, Annie finished. So the men who killed my parents get to profit from their crime. The bitterness in her voice reminded Jonas of his own anger in the months following Helena's death. The rage that had nearly destroyed him before Annie's arrival had given him a reason to hope again. Maybe not, he said slowly, an idea beginning to form. Your father was thorough about documentation. If he kept proper records of the purchase, of the threats he received, of the original survey work, he did, Annie said quickly. Papa kept everything in a special strongbox. He said important papers were like gold. You guard them with your life because replacing them might be impossible. Jonas felt a spark of hope for the first time since discovering the truth about Thomas Fitzgerald's death. Do you know what happened to that strongbox? Annie's expression grew thoughtful. I hid it the night Papa died. He told me to take it and the recipe book and run if trouble came. I buried it in the woods near our old place, under a lightning-struck oak tree. The revelation that crucial evidence might still exist sent Jonas's mind racing with possibilities. If they could recover Thomas's documents, they might have enough proof to challenge the men who had stolen the mining rights and killed Annie's parents. We need to get that strongbox, Jonas said, his voice carrying a determination Annie hadn't heard before. But those men, if they killed Papa and Mama, won't they try to kill us too? Jonas looked down at Annie's trusting face and felt something harden in his chest. For 3 years, he'd been running from the violence that seemed to follow him everywhere. But this was different. This wasn't about his own pain or anger, but about protecting someone innocent and reclaiming justice for the dead. Let them try, he said quietly. Your father trusted me with something precious when he made me his partner. I may have failed him then, but I won't fail you now. That evening, as they planned their journey to recover the hidden strongbox, Jonas felt the familiar weight of his father's old Colt revolver as he checked its action and loaded fresh cartridges. Violence had taken too much from both of them already, but sometimes the only way to protect what mattered was to meet force with force. Annie watched him prepare with solemn understanding beyond her years. Papa used to say that some fights choose you, whether you want them or not. Your father was a wise man, Jonas replied. And he raised a daughter who's got his courage and her mother's heart. As they made their final preparations, Neither of them noticed the riders who had been watching Jonas's cabin from the distant hills, or the glint of sunlight reflecting off-field glasses as someone studied their every movement. The map that had revealed their shared past had also revealed their vulnerability, and there were men who had grown wealthy from Thomas Fitzgerald's death, who had no intention of allowing his daughter to reclaim what was rightfully hers outside. The wind carried the scent of approaching storms, both natural and man-made, while inside the cabin, two people who had found family in each other prepared to fight for the justice that had been too long delayed. The riders came at dawn, three men in expensive suits that looked out of place on the Montana frontier, accompanied by a territorial marshal whose badge gleamed with the authority of distant government offices. Jonas watched them approach from his kitchen window, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that now leaned against the wall. His father's old hunting rifle, gleaned and loaded for the first time in 3 years. "Annie," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching horseman, "remember what we talked about. Stay calm, answer only what you're asked, and let me do most of the talking." Annie moved to stand beside him at the window, her small hand finding his larger one with a trust that made Jonas's chest tighten with protective fury. She wore the new dress they'd made from Mrs. Brennan's fabric, and her hair was neatly braided. She looked every inch the well-cared-for child, which might matter more than Jonas cared to admit in the coming confrontation. "Are those the men who hurt Papa and Mama?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear Jonas could see in her eyes. "I don't know yet," Jonas replied honestly. "But they're here about the land, about the mining rights. That much is certain." The lead rider dismounted with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through a combination of money and intimidation. He was perhaps 50 years old, well-fed and prosperous, with the soft hands of someone who profited from other men's labor. His companions flanked him as he approached Jonas's door, their positioning suggesting this wasn't their first time delivering unwelcome news to reluctant landowners. The knock, when it came, was authoritative but not quite aggressive, the sound of men who believed they held all the legal cards and saw no need for immediate violence. Jonas opened the door with Annie close behind him, his presence filling the doorframe in a way that made even confident men reconsider their approach. The rifle remained visible but not overtly threatening, a reminder that this conversation could take several different directions depending on how it proceeded. "Mr. Redwood," the lead man said, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "My name is Harrison Blackwood. I represent certain business interests that have a legal claim to this property. I believe it's time we had a conversation about your continued residency here." Jonas studied Blackwood's face, noting the expensive clothes, the manicured fingernails, and the way the man's gaze swept over Annie with calculation rather than warmth. This was a predator, but one who preferred legal manipulation to direct violence, at least initially. "I've got legal title to this land," Jonas said calmly. "Filed proper with the territorial office, paid all taxes, improved the property according to law. What exactly do you think gives you a claim here?" Blackwood produced a leather portfolio from his coat, withdrawing documents that appeared official and intimidating. "I'm afraid there are irregularities in your original filing, Mr. Redwood. Certain mineral rights that were never properly transferred, survey boundaries that overlap with prior claims. My clients have been quite patient about resolving these matters quietly, but patience has its limits." Annie squeezed Jonas's hand, and he felt her tension even as she maintained outward composure. She understood enough about legal documents to know that men with money could make paperwork say almost anything they wanted. "What kind of irregularities?" Jonas asked, accepting the documents but not inviting the men inside. The territorial marshal, a thin man with nervous eyes who clearly wished he were anywhere else, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Redwood, I've been instructed to inform you that these gentlemen have filed formal challenges to your land claim. Until the matter is resolved in territorial court, you're requested to vacate the premises. Requested, Jonas repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. That's an interesting word choice, Marshal. Am I under legal obligation to leave my own property based on unproven accusations? The Marshal's discomfort was obvious. Well, no, not exactly. But Mr. Blackwood's clients have significant resources, and they're prepared to pursue this matter vigorously. It might be easier for everyone if I just walked away from everything I've built here, Jonas finished. Handed over my land and my livelihood to men I've never met, based on documents I haven't had time to examine. Blackwood's smile remained fixed, but Jonas caught the flash of irritation in his eyes. Mr. Redwood, surely we can discuss this like reasonable men. My clients are prepared to offer fair compensation for any improvements you've made to the property. You and the child would be free to relocate wherever you choose. The casual mention of Annie as the child sent a chill down Jonas's spine. These men knew about her, had planned for her presence, which suggested they understood exactly who she was and what she represented to their claims. And if I choose not to accept your generous offer? Jonas asked. Then we proceed through legal channels, Blackwood replied smoothly. Courts can be expensive, Mr. Redwood, and time-consuming. A man with limited resources might find himself bankrupt long before. Reaching a final judgment, the threat was clear. They would use their wealth and legal connections to drag out proceedings, until Jonas couldn't afford to continue fighting. It was a strategy that had probably worked dozens of times before, against frontier settlers who lacked the resources to challenge powerful interests. I'll need time to review these documents, Jonas said finally, and to consult with my own legal representation. Blackwood's expression suggested he doubted Jonas had access to any legal representation worth worrying about. Of course. Take all the time you need. We'll return in, shall we say, 1 week for your answer? After the men had ridden away, Jonas spread Blackwood's documents across his kitchen table, while Annie watched with the intensity of someone whose future hung in the balance. The papers were indeed impressive. Official seals, legal language, and references to territorial statutes that seemed to support their claims. It's all lies, Annie said quietly after Jonas had finished reading. Papa filed everything proper. He showed me the documents, explained how the mineral rights transfer worked. These men are trying to steal what belongs to us. Jonas felt a fierce pride in Annie's clear-eyed assessment of their situation. Despite her age, she understood the fundamental injustice of what they were facing, and she'd said us, not me, when talking about the stolen rights. You're right, he agreed. But proving their lies in territorial court, with judges who might be influenced by Blackwood's money, won't be easy. Then what do we do? Jonas looked down at Annie's trusting face and felt the same protective rage that had driven him to violence in the past. But this time, the anger was tempered by purpose and focused by love. He wasn't fighting for his own pain anymore, but for Annie's future and her parents' memory. We get that strongbox, he said firmly. We gather every piece of evidence your father left behind, and then we make these bastards prove their claims in broad daylight, where everyone can see exactly what kind of men they really are. That evening, Jonas completed work on the wooden doll he'd been carving for Annie, sanding the final details smooth and applying a protective finish that would help it last for years. As he worked, Annie practiced her letters by lamplight, copying passages from one of Doc Peterson's books with careful attention to penmanship. Annie, Jonas said, as he held up the finished doll for her inspection. I want you to have this. Annie's face lit up with genuine delight as she accepted the gift, turning it over in her hands to admire the careful craftsmanship. The doll was simple but beautifully made, with a serene expression and clothes carved to suggest a frontier woman ready for any challenge. She's beautiful, Annie breathed. Thank you, Mr. Redwood. I'll treasure her always. I want you to know, Jonas said carefully, that no matter what happens with these land disputes, you'll always have a place with me. You're not just earning your keep anymore, Annie. You're family. Annie's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide. Do you mean it? Really and truly. Really and truly, Jonas confirmed. If you'll have me, I'd like to be your guardian, legal and proper the way your parents would have wanted. Annie threw her arms around Jonas's neck, the wooden doll clutched safely in one hand. "Yes," she whispered fiercely. "Yes, I want that more than anything." As they held each other in the lamplight, both of them understood that the stakes of their fight had just increased dramatically. They weren't just battling for land or money anymore. They were fighting for the right to be a family. For the future they were building together against men who would destroy anything to get what they wanted. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and somewhere in the darkness, Harrison Blackwood's men were planning their next move, in a game where the rules favored those with the deepest pockets and the fewest scruples. But inside Jonas's cabin, love had drawn its own line in the sand, and some lines, once drawn, were worth any sacrifice to defend. The attack came 2 nights before Blackwood's promised return, under a moonless sky that provided perfect cover for men who preferred to work in darkness. Jonas awakened to the sound of breaking glass and the acrid smell of smoke, his soldier's instincts honed by years of frontier violence, bringing him instantly alert. "Annie!" he called sharply, rolling from his bed and grabbing the rifle that never left his side anymore. "Get down and stay low." Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, muzzle flashes lighting up the night like deadly fireflies. Jonas could see at least 4 shapes moving around his cabin, and the smell of coal oil told him they'd set fire to his barn. This wasn't a legal battle anymore. Blackwood had decided to solve his problem with more direct methods. Annie crawled across the floor toward Jonas, clutching the wooden doll he'd made for her. In the chaos and firelight, something caught Jonas's eye. The doll had broken when Annie dropped it, and from the hollow interior a small object had fallen out. "Stay down," Jonas ordered, then risked a glance at what had emerged from the broken doll. His heart stopped when he recognized what he was seeing, a gold locket, delicate and feminine, with an intricate design that seemed familiar. Annie saw it too, her eyes widening with recognition and pain. "Mama's locket," she whispered. "I thought it was lost in the fire." "Open it," Jonas said urgently, even as bullets shattered what remained of his windows. "Quickly, Annie, open it." With trembling fingers, Annie pried open the locket's tiny clasp. Inside, where most women would have kept a miniature portrait or lock of hair, was something far more valuable, a small, perfectly preserved photograph showing 2 men shaking hands over a pile of official documents. Jonas's blood turned to ice as he recognized the figures in the photograph. One was Annie's father, Thomas Fitzgerald, looking years younger but unmistakably himself. The other was Jonas, on the day they'd signed their original partnership agreement for the mining rights. But that wasn't what made Jonas's world suddenly rearrange itself with sickening clarity. In the background of the photograph, clearly visible and perfectly preserved, were the original survey documents, including mineral assay reports that showed deposits far more valuable than even Jonas had suspected. "Annie," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of amazement and growing understanding, "where did you get this locket?" "It was Mama's," Annie said, confused by his intensity. "She always wore it, said it contained the most important thing in the world. Papa gave it to me right before—" her voice broke. "Right before he died. He said if anything happened to him and Mama, I should keep it safe because it proved who I really was." The pieces of a puzzle 3 years in the making suddenly clicked into place with devastating clarity. Thomas Fitzgerald hadn't just been Jonas's partner in a mining venture. He'd been protecting evidence that could prove Annie's inheritance rights to mining claims worth a fortune. "Annie," Jonas said carefully, "your father wasn't just my partner. According to this photograph, he held majority ownership of the mineral rights. That locket doesn't just prove your connection to the land. It proves you're the rightful heir to one of the richest silver deposits in the territory." The implication hit them both simultaneously. Annie wasn't just an orphan girl Jonas had taken in out of charity. She was potentially one of the wealthiest landowners in Montana. If her inheritance could be legally recognized, "That's why they killed Papa and Mama," Annie whispered, understanding flooding her young face with terrible clarity. "Not just to steal the mining rights, but to eliminate the only person who could prove they belonged to our family." Jonas felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Blackwood and his associates hadn't just murdered Thomas and Sarah Fitzgerald for their mining claims, they'd been systematically eliminating anyone who could challenge their theft. Annie's survival and her arrival at Jonas's cabin represented the one thing they couldn't account for, a living heir with documentary proof of her inheritance. The gunfire outside intensified, and Jonas realized that tonight's attack wasn't random violence. It was a carefully planned attempt to eliminate the last two people who could expose their crimes. "We have to get out of here," Jonas said, checking his ammunition. "They're not trying to scare us anymore. They're trying to kill us." Annie's face was pale but determined. "The strongbox, Mr. Redwood. If this locket proves I'm Papa's heir, the strongbox will have all the legal documents to back it up. We have to get to it before they do." Jonas nodded grimly. The photograph in Annie's locket was powerful evidence, but they'd need every document Thomas Fitzgerald had preserved to make their case in territorial court. A new sound joined the gunfire, the pounding of hoofbeats approaching fast. Jonas risked a look through a bullet-shattered window and felt a surge of hope when he recognized Sheriff Murphy leading a group of armed townspeople toward the cabin. "Jonas!" the sheriff's voice carried over the gunfire. "We saw the smoke from town. Hold on." The attackers, caught between Jonas's defensive fire and the approaching townspeople, began to retreat toward horses they'd hidden in the trees. But not before one of them threw a final torch onto Jonas's cabin roof, ensuring that even if they couldn't kill their targets tonight, they could destroy any evidence that might be hidden inside. As flames began to spread across the roof, Jonas grabbed Annie and what few possessions they could carry, including the precious locket and the surveyor's map. Everything else, the home they'd built together, the domestic peace they'd found, the sanctuary where they'd learned to be a family, was burning around them. Sheriff Murphy and his men arrived just as Jonas and Annie emerged from the cabin, their faces blackened with smoke, but their spirits unbroken. The attackers had vanished into the night, leaving behind only hoofprints and the smell of coal oil. "Jonas, thank God you're both all right," Sheriff Murphy said, his relief obvious. Mrs. Brennan saw the smoke and raised the alarm. "We came as fast as we could." As the townspeople organized bucket brigades to save what they could of Jonas's property, Sheriff Murphy pulled him aside for a private conversation. "This wasn't random, was it?" the sheriff asked quietly. "This has to do with those legal papers Blackwood showed you." Jonas nodded, his arm around Annie's shoulders as they watched their home burn. "It has to do with a lot more than legal papers, Sheriff. We're dealing with men who've already committed murder, and they won't stop until they eliminate everyone who can expose them. What do you need from me?" Jonas looked down at Annie, who clutched her mother's locket with a determination that reminded him powerfully of her father's stubborn courage. "A fast horse and a safe escort," Jonas said. "We have evidence that can bring down Blackwood and his whole operation, but we need to recover it before they figure out where it's hidden." Sheriff Murphy studied Jonas's face in the firelight, seeing a resolve there that hadn't existed since Helena's death. "You're talking about justice for the Fitzgeralds." "I'm talking about justice for Annie," Jonas corrected. "And for every honest settler who's been murdered or driven off their land by men like Blackwood." As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of their cabin, Jonas and Annie prepared for a journey that would either restore Annie's rightful inheritance or get them both killed. The locket's revelation had changed everything. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, but for the truth about one of the territory's most valuable mining claims. And somewhere in the distance, Harrison Blackwood was realizing that his carefully planned elimination of the Fitzgerald family had failed in the worst possible way. Not only had the heir survived, but she'd found a protector willing to die for her cause. The war for Annie's inheritance was about to begin in earnest, and both sides understood that only one could survive the coming confrontation. The charred remains of Jonas's cabin stood like a monument to Blackwood's desperation, smoke still rising from the ashes in thin grey columns that could be seen for miles across the Montana prairie. As the sun climbed higher, revealing the full extent of the destruction, the townspeople of Ember Creek gathered to offer support with the kind of practical generosity that defined frontier communities. Mrs. Brennan arrived with a wagon full of supplies, blankets, food and clothing hastily gathered from willing neighbors. Doc Peterson brought his medical bag and a grim determination to see justice done for people he'd grown to care about. Even Mrs. Hutchins, who had been among Annie's harshest critics, showed up with a basket of preserves and a grudging admission that nobody deserves to have their home burned down by thugs. But it was Sheriff Murphy who brought the most important contribution, a bundle of legal documents wrapped in oiled cloth, protected from the morning dew and the weight of terrible implications. "I've been doing some investigating of my own," Sheriff Murphy told Jonas and Annie as they huddled around a campfire built from the remains of Jonas's fence posts. "After Blackwood's visit, I sent telegrams to the territorial offices, asking questions about mining claims and property transfers in this area." Annie looked up from the wooden doll she'd been trying to repair, her face streaked with soot, but her eyes bright with hope. "What did you find out?" Sheriff Murphy's expression was grim as he unwrapped the documents. "I found out that your father, Thomas Fitzgerald, filed the most complete and legally sound mining claim in territorial history. Every piece of paperwork properly executed, every fee paid, every requirement met to the letter." Jonas felt a surge of vindication for his former partner's memory. Thomas was always thorough about legal matters. He said shortcuts in paperwork led to disasters in the courtroom. "He was right to be careful," Sheriff Murphy continued, "because I also found out that Harrison Blackwood and his associates have been systematically challenging mining claims throughout the territory, using fraudulent documents and bought judges to steal valuable properties from legitimate owners." Annie's small hands clenched into fists. "How many families have they destroyed?" "Too many," Sheriff Murphy admitted. "But here's what they didn't count on. Your father was smarter than most. He didn't just file his claims with the territorial office. He also sent copies to the Federal Mining Bureau, the Territorial Governor's Office, and the Military Land Commission. He created a paper trail so complete that even corrupted local officials couldn't make it disappear." Jonas studied the documents Sheriff Murphy had brought, recognizing Thomas Fitzgerald's meticulous handwriting and careful attention to detail. "These prove Annie's inheritance?" "They prove more than that," Sheriff Murphy said with satisfaction. "They prove that Blackwood's entire operation is built on fraud and murder. With these documents and the evidence in Annie's locket, we can bring down his whole conspiracy." Doc Peterson, who had been listening quietly while tending to minor burns on Jonas's hands, looked up with concern. "That's assuming we can get the evidence to honest authorities before Blackwood realizes what we have." The sobering reminder hung in the air like the smoke from Jonas's destroyed home. They had evidence that could expose Blackwood's crimes, but they were isolated on the frontier with limited resources and powerful enemies who wouldn't hesitate to kill them all to protect their secrets. "What about the strongbox?" Annie asked. "Papa's strongbox with all the original documents?" Jonas had been thinking about that problem since the attack. "It's still buried where you left it, but Blackwood's men will be watching every move we make. Getting to it won't be simple." "Then we don't go alone," Doc Peterson said firmly. "We organize a proper expedition, armed men, multiple witnesses, and enough firepower to discourage any attempts at interference." Sheriff Murphy nodded approvingly. "Doc's right. This isn't just about recovering documents anymore. It's about making a public stand against corruption. If we do this right, word will spread throughout the territory that honest settlers don't have to bow down to men like Blackwood." As they planned their strategy, Annie worked with determined concentration to repair her broken doll. The wooden figure had cracked when she dropped it during the attack, but the pieces could be fitted back together with patience and care. Watching her work, Jonas was struck by the parallel. Their family, their home, their future had all been damaged by Blackwood's violence. But they could be rebuilt if they had the courage to try, Annie, Jonas said gently. I want you to understand something. What we're planning to do is dangerous. Blackwood has already shown he's willing to kill to protect his secrets. If you want to walk away from this, find safety somewhere far from here. I'll understand. Annie looked up from her repair work with an expression that reminded Jonas powerfully of her father's stubborn integrity. Mr. Redwood, those men killed my mama and papa. They burned down our home. They're trying to steal what belongs to us and hurt the people who've shown us kindness. She held up the partially repaired doll. Some things are worth fighting for, even if it's scary. Jonas felt his heart swell with pride and protective love. In that case, we'd better make sure we're prepared for whatever Blackwood throws at us. The rest of the day was spent in careful preparation. Sheriff Murphy organized a group of trustworthy men, farmers, shopkeepers, and frontier veterans who understood the importance of standing up to corruption. Doc Peterson prepared medical supplies for what might become a violent confrontation. Mrs. Brennan coordinated provisions for an expedition that might last several days. Jonas spent his time teaching Annie advanced skills that no 8-year-old would know how to recognize the sound of different types of gunfire, how to find cover in open terrain, how to signal for help if they became separated. It broke his heart to burden her young mind with such knowledge, but her safety might depend on understanding the realities of their situation. That evening, as they camped in the ruins of their home, Jonas and Annie sat by their fire and talked about the future they hoped to build once Blackwood's threat was eliminated. When this is all over, Annie said, carefully applying wood glue to the cracks in her doll. Will we rebuild the cabin exactly the way it was? Jonas considered the question seriously. Would you want it exactly the same? Annie thought about this with the same concentration she brought to her repair work. Maybe mostly the same, but with some improvements. A bigger kitchen for when we have company. A real bedroom for me instead of just a sleeping area. And maybe a workshop where you could carve more dolls and other beautiful things. The simple domestic vision she painted, a life of modest comfort, honest work, and shared purpose, struck Jonas as the most worthwhile thing he could possibly fight for. That sounds perfect, he said quietly. But Annie, I want you to know that home isn't really about the building. Home is about the people who matter to you, the ones you'd do anything to protect. Annie finished applying glue to the last crack in her doll and held it up to catch the firelight. The repair lines were visible but not ugly. They told a story of damage survived and wholeness restored. I know, she said simply. Home is wherever we're together. As they prepared for sleep under the open sky, Jonas checked and rechecked his weapons, while Annie practiced loading techniques he'd taught her for the small pistol Doc Peterson had insisted she carry. Neither of them spoke about the possibility that tomorrow's mission might be their last day together. But both understood the stakes. In the distance, coyotes howled their ancient songs to the stars, and somewhere in that vast darkness, Harrison Blackwood was planning his own final gambit to eliminate the threats to his stolen empire. But around their small fire, two people who had found family in each other drew strength from their shared determination to see justice done, no matter the cost. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that had been building since the day Annie first knocked on Jonas's door, and both of them were ready to fight for the future they'd discovered together. The bundle of legal documents lay wrapped and protected near their fire, representing not just Annie's inheritance, but the hope that truth and courage could still triumph over greed and violence in a world that often seemed to reward the worst in human nature. As the fire burned down to embers, Jonas and Annie slept with weapons close at hand and dreams of justice dancing in their hearts, while the stars kept watch over two souls preparing for the battle that would determine whether love could truly conquer all. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Montana landscape as Jonas, Annie, and their small band of allies made their way toward the grove, where Thomas Fitzgerald's strongbox lay buried beneath 3 years of prairie grass and accumulated secrets. Sheriff Murphy rode point, his badge gleaming with the authority of territorial law, while Doc Peterson brought up the rear with his medical bag and a determination that surprised everyone who knew him as a gentle healer. The expedition consisted of 8 adults and one very determined 8-year-old girl who rode beside Jonas with the composure of someone much older. Annie had insisted on wearing her father's old surveying compass around her neck, a piece of equipment that would help them locate the buried strongbox, but also served as a tangible connection to the man whose legacy they were fighting to preserve. Jonas found himself studying Annie's face as they rode, noting the way she held herself straight in the saddle, despite the weight of everything that depended on their success. Somewhere during their weeks together, she had grown from a desperate child, seeking shelter, into a young woman with the kind of courage that inspired grown men to risk their lives for justice. "There," Annie said, as they crested a low hill, pointing toward a lightning-scarred oak tree that stood alone in a small clearing. "That's where Papa told me to hide if trouble came." The tree was massive and ancient, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. Lightning had indeed struck it years ago, leaving a distinctive split down one side that made it unmistakable as a landmark. Jonas could see why Thomas Fitzgerald had chosen this spot. It was defensible, easily identified, and far enough from main travel routes to avoid accidental discovery. Sheriff Murphy held up his hand, signaling the group to halt while he studied the terrain, with the practiced eye of a man who had survived numerous frontier conflicts. "I don't like the feel of this," he said quietly. "Too much open ground, too many places for ambush." As if summoned by his words, riders appeared on the ridgelines surrounding the clearing, a dozen men armed with rifles and positioned to control every avenue of escape. At their head rode Harrison Blackwood himself, no longer bothering with the pretense of legal proceedings or civilized negotiations. "Mr. Redwood," Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "How convenient to find you here, so far from witnesses and legal protections. I believe you have something that belongs to my clients." Jonas drew his father's rifle from its scabbard, the familiar weight of the weapon steadying his nerves. Around him, the other men of Ember Creek readied their own firearms with the calm efficiency of people who had always known this confrontation was inevitable. "The only thing I have," Jonas called back, "is the truth about what you did to the Fitzgerald family, and the evidence to prove it." Blackwood's laughter echoed off the surrounding hills with genuine amusement. "Evidence? Mr. Redwood, you're in the middle of nowhere with a handful of shopkeepers and farmers. Even if you had evidence, which I doubt, who would you present it to? The territorial authorities who have already accepted my documentation? The courts that have validated my client's claims?" Annie urged her horse forward slightly, her young voice carrying with surprising strength. "I know who you are, Mr. Blackwood. You're the man who murdered my parents because they wouldn't sell you what was rightfully ours." "Annie, stay back," Jonas warned, but she continued speaking with the kind of fearless honesty that had characterized her father. "My papa kept records of everything," Annie said, her hand moving to the locket at her throat. "Every threat you made, every illegal offer, every attempt to steal our mining rights. And he taught me to read maps and survey documents, so I know exactly what you're really after." Blackwood's expression darkened as he realized that this wasn't just about recovering incriminating documents. They were dealing with a living witness who understood the full scope of his crimes. "Enough," he said sharply, raising his hand in a signal to his men. "I've wasted too much time on legal niceties. Kill them all and burn whatever they might have found." The order to open fire came simultaneously from both sides, as if the morning had been waiting for violence to shatter its peace. Jonas threw himself from his saddle, grabbing Annie and pulling her behind the massive trunk of the lightning-struck oak as bullets whined through the air where they had been sitting moments before. Sheriff Murphy's voice rose above the gunfire, calling tactical instructions to the townspeople who had volunteered for this mission. "Find cover and make every shot count. We're outnumbered, but we have better position. Doc Peterson, moving with surprising agility for a man his age, had found shelter behind a fallen log and was methodically returning fire with a hunting rifle that hadn't seen action since his own frontier days. "Jonas," he called. "The strong box. We need to find it before they overrun our position." Annie, her face pale but determined, was already studying the base of the oak tree with the focused attention her father had taught her. "It should be here," she said, running her hands along the massive roots. "Papa said 10 paces due north from the lightning scar, buried 3 feet deep." Jonas found himself torn between the need to defend their position and the urgency of recovering the evidence that could expose Blackwood's conspiracy. The gunfire was intensifying, and he could see Blackwood's men beginning to advance under cover of concentrated fire. "There!" Annie exclaimed, her fingers finding a slight depression in the earth that suggested something had been buried there. "Help me dig, Mr. Redwood." Jonas pulled out the small shovel they'd brought for this purpose, working frantically while trying to keep himself between Annie and the worst of the gunfire. The soil was hard-packed from 3 years of weather, but after several minutes of desperate digging, the shovel struck something solid. "That's it," Annie breathed, her eyes bright with triumph and relief. "That's Papa's strongbox." Together, they pulled the metal container from its hiding place, brushing away dirt to reveal a waterproof seal that had protected its contents through years of Montana weather. The box was heavier than Jonas had expected, suggesting it contained not just documents but other valuable items Thomas Fitzgerald had wanted to preserve. A bullet spanged off the oak tree, inches from Jonas's head, reminding him that their mission was far from complete. They had the evidence, but they still had to survive long enough to present it to honest authorities. "Sheriff," Jonas called. "We've got it! We've got the strongbox!" Sheriff Murphy's face lit up with fierce satisfaction as he reloaded his rifle. "Then let's get you and Annie out of here alive to use it." But even as he spoke, they could all see that their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Blackwood's men had the advantages of numbers and position, and they were pressing their attack with the desperation of people who understood that failure meant exposure and prosecution for multiple murders. Annie clutched the strongbox against her chest, her father's compass swinging from its chain as she moved. "Mr. Redwood," she said quietly, "whatever happens, promise me you'll make sure the truth gets out. Promise me Papa and Mama won't be forgotten." Jonas looked down at the brave child who had brought meaning back into his life, who had taught him that love was worth fighting for and that justice was worth dying for. "I promise," he said solemnly, checking the action on his rifle. "But we're both going to live to see your father's work vindicated. We're both going to see you claim what's rightfully yours." As the gunfire intensified and Blackwood's men prepared for a final assault, Jonas slipped his father's wedding ring back onto his finger, a symbol of his readiness to honor love and family. Again, by protecting Annie with his life, the battle for Annie's inheritance and her family's justice was reaching its climax, and only one side would survive to see the truth revealed in the morning light. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from the east caused both sides to pause in their gunfight. Weapons still trained on each other, but attention divided by the possibility of new players entering their deadly game. Jonas risked a glance from behind the oak tree and felt his heart surge with hope when he saw the distinctive blue uniforms of territorial cavalry cresting the ridge. "Federal Marshals!" Sheriff Murphy shouted, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and triumph. "Someone got word to the territorial authorities." The cavalry unit, 24 mounted soldiers, led by a grim-faced marshal with a silver star pinned to his coat, descended into the clearing with the kind of disciplined precision that made Blackwood's hired guns suddenly reconsider their odds. The marshal's voice cut through the morning air with military authority. "This is United States Marshal James Crawford. By order of the territorial governor, all parties will lay down their weapons immediately." Blackwood's men, faced with federal intervention, began lowering their rifles with obvious reluctance. Their leader, however, seemed more surprised than defeated, his eyes narrowing as he studied the unexpected arrivals. "Marshal Crawford," Blackwood called, his voice regaining some of its earlier confidence. "I'm Harrison Blackwood, representing legitimate business interests in this area. These people are trespassing on property that rightfully belongs to my clients." Marshal Crawford dismounted and approached the clearing with his hand resting on his sidearm. "Mr. Blackwood, I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and murder in connection with illegal mining claim seizures throughout the territory." The words hit Blackwood like physical blows, his face draining of color as he realized that his carefully constructed empire of corruption was collapsing around him. "That's impossible. I have documentation, legal precedent. You have forged documents and bought judges," Marshal Crawford interrupted coldly. "We've been investigating your operations for months, waiting for enough evidence to move against you." The Fitzgerald case provided exactly what we needed. Annie emerged from behind the oak tree, still clutching her father's strongbox, her young face bright with vindication and justice, long delayed. "Marshal, I'm Annie Mae Fitzgerald. These men killed my parents and tried to steal our mining claims." Marshal Crawford's stern expression softened slightly as he looked down at Annie, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the dignity with which she carried herself despite her obvious youth. "Miss Fitzgerald, I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your father's documentation of Mr. Blackwood's criminal activities has been instrumental in our investigation." He turned back to Blackwood with cold satisfaction. "Did you really think you could murder federal claimants and steal their property without consequences?" The final confrontation erupted with sudden violence as one of Blackwood's men, realizing that capture meant hanging, made a desperate grab for his rifle. Jonas reacted instantly, his shot taking the man down before he could complete his draw, while the federal marshals moved with coordinated efficiency to disarm and arrest the remaining conspirators. In the chaos, Blackwood himself made a run for his horse, only to find his path blocked by Doc Peterson, who had emerged from cover with his medical bag in one hand and a Colt revolver in the other. "I don't think so." "Harrison," Doc Peterson said with quiet authority, "you're going to face justice for what you did to Thomas and Sarah Fitzgerald, and all the other innocent people you've murdered." Blackwood's capture was swift and decisive, his hands bound with federal restraints, while Marshal Crawford read the charges against him in a voice that carried across the clearing for all to hear. As the immediate danger passed, Jonas felt the full weight of his wounds, a bullet graze along his ribs and burns on his hands from their escape from the burning cabin. But Annie's safety and the successful recovery of her father's evidence made his injuries seem trivial by comparison. "Jonas," Doc Peterson said, approaching with his medical bag already open, "let me take a look at those wounds." As Doc Peterson worked, cleaning and bandaging the bullet graze with practiced efficiency, Annie opened her father's strongbox with trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were dozens of documents that painted a complete picture of Blackwood's conspiracy. Maps showing the true extent of the silver deposits, correspondence threatening Thomas Fitzgerald, and legal papers proving Annie's inheritance beyond any possible dispute. "Look at this," Annie breathed, holding up a document that made Marshal Crawford whistle with amazement. "That's a federal geological survey," the marshal said, studying the technical drawings and mineral estimates. "According to this, your father's claims contain enough silver to make you one of the wealthiest individuals in the territory." Sheriff Murphy, who had been securing Blackwood's captured men, paused to examine the survey with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Thomas Fitzgerald was sitting on a fortune, and he knew it. No wonder Blackwood was willing to kill for it. As the full scope of Annie's inheritance became clear, Jonas felt a mixture of joy and apprehension. Annie would never want for anything material, but great wealth would bring its own challenges and dangers. She would need protection, education, and guidance to manage such resources responsibly. "Mr. Redwood," Annie said quietly, seeming to read his thoughts. "This changes things, doesn't it? Now that She struggled with the concept of wealth beyond her young understanding. Now that I have all this, will you still want to be my guardian?" Jonas knelt beside her, ignoring the pain in his wounded ribs, and took her small hands in his scarred ones. "Annie Mae Fitzgerald, I didn't ask to be your guardian because you might be wealthy someday. I asked because you brought light back into my life when I thought it was gone forever. Wealth doesn't change that." Annie's smile was radiant as she threw her arms around Jonas's neck, careful of his injuries but fierce in her affection. "Then we'll figure out what to do with all this money together. Maybe we can help other people who've lost their families, or build schools, or slow down," Jonas laughed, holding her close. "We have plenty of time to make those decisions. First, we need to make sure all the legal matters are properly handled." Marshal Crawford, who had been organizing his prisoners for the journey back to territorial headquarters, approached them with a telegram that had just arrived via military courier. "This is from the territorial governor," he announced. "In recognition of the evidence you've provided and the courage you've shown, you're both hereby granted full protection under territorial law. Miss Fitzgerald's inheritance is officially recognized, and Mr. Redwood is approved as her legal guardian pending formal court proceedings." The telegram represented more than legal validation. It was official recognition that their unconventional family was legitimate and protected under territorial law. As the day wore on, and Blackwood's men were led away in chains, the people of Ember Creek, who had risked their lives for justice, began the journey home with the satisfaction of having stood up to corruption and won. Annie rode beside Jonas, her father's strongbox secured in her saddlebags and her mother's locket gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The wooden doll, carefully repaired, sat in her lap as a reminder that broken things could be made whole again with patience and love. "Mr. Redwood," she said as they approached the ruins of their cabin, "when we rebuild our home, can we make sure there's room for other people who might need a place to stay? Other children who might not have anywhere else to go?" Jonas smiled at her generous spirit, recognizing in her words the same compassion that had driven her parents to help others throughout their lives. "I think that's exactly what your father would have wanted," he said quietly. "A home where love and justice could flourish together." As the sun set over the Montana prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, two people who had found family in each other began planning a future built on the foundation of justice served and love triumphant. 6 months after the confrontation at the lightning-struck oak, the new cabin that rose from the ashes of the old one bore little resemblance to the humble structure where Jonas had lived in isolation for 3 years. Built with lumber purchased from Annie's mining inheritance and designed according to her generous vision, it was larger, brighter, and specifically planned to welcome others in need of shelter and hope. The kitchen, as Annie had dreamed, was spacious enough to accommodate cooking for 12 people, with a massive stone hearth that served as the heart of their expanded home. 2 guest rooms had been added for children who might need temporary refuge, and Jonas's workshop occupied a sunny corner where he could carve toys and furniture for the growing community of families they were helping to support. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and scarlet, Annie stood at the kitchen window watching Jonas teach 3 recently orphaned children how to properly care for horses. At nearly 9 years old, she had grown taller and more confident, but retained the compassionate wisdom that had drawn Jonas to her from their first meeting. "Miss Annie," called 7-year-old Tommy Morrison, "one of their newest residents, when will you teach us to read like you do?" Annie smiled, wiping flour from her hands before joining the children at the corral. "Right after lunch, Tommy. We'll start with the alphabet, just like Papa taught me." The children gathered around her with the eager attention of young minds hungry for knowledge and stability. Since word had spread about the Redwood Fitzgerald Home for Children, as the territorial newspapers had begun calling it, a steady stream of orphaned and displaced children had found their way to their door, drawn by stories of a place where love mattered more than legal paperwork. Jonas approached the group. his face showing the kind of contentment that had replaced the haunted expression Annie remembered from their early days together. His wedding band caught the morning sunlight. He wore it now as a symbol of his commitment to the family they were building. Different from his marriage to Helena, but no less profound in its meaning. "How are our newest students doing?" he asked, ruffling Tommy's hair with gentle affection. "Mr. Jonas is teaching us about responsibility," announced 8-year-old Mary Caldwell, whose parents had died in a mine collapse 2 months earlier. "He says taking care of animals teaches you to take care of people. Smart man." "That Mr. Jonas," Annie said with mock seriousness, earning giggles from the children and a warm smile from Jonas himself. Doc Peterson's arrival interrupted their lesson, his familiar medical bag slung over his shoulder, but his expression carrying news rather than medical urgency. "Jonas, Annie, I have something I think you'll want to see." He produced the official-looking envelope, bearing the territorial seal, the kind of document that had once carried threats, but now brought validation and recognition. "What is it?" Annie asked, accepting the envelope with careful attention. "Recognition from the territorial legislature," Doc Peterson said with obvious pride. "They're officially commending your work with displaced children and authorizing the establishment of the Fitzgerald Foundation for Frontier Families." Annie's eyes widened as she read the formal language that granted her foundation legal status and territorial protection. The mining wealth that had cost her parents their lives was now being used to ensure that other children would never face the kind of desperate circumstances that had driven her to Jonas's door. "This means we can help even more families," she said, her voice filled with wonder at the possibilities. "We can build schools, establish orphanages in other towns, maybe even start a program to help widows and single mothers." Jonas felt his chest swell with pride as he watched Annie envision ways to use her inheritance for the benefit of others. Thomas and Sarah Fitzgerald had raised a daughter who understood that true wealth lay not in what you accumulated, but in what you shared with those in need. "There's more," Doc Peterson continued, his eyes twinkling with the kind of mischief that suggested he'd saved the best news for last. "The territorial governor wants to meet with you both next month. Seems there's talk of appointing Annie as the youngest member of the Territorial Education Commission." The children erupted in cheers at the news, proud to be associated with someone important enough to advise the territorial government. Annie blushed at the attention, but accepted the honor with the same grace she brought to everything else. That evening, as the children settled into their beds and the house grew quiet, Jonas and Annie sat in their comfortable parlor working on the correspondence that had become a regular part of their lives. Letters arrived daily from families seeking help, from officials requesting advice on frontier policy, and from other communities hoping to establish similar programs. Annie worked at a small desk Jonas had built specifically for her, practicing the careful penmanship her father had taught her while composing responses to the week's letters. Her mother's recipe book lay open beside her, not for cooking instructions, but as inspiration. Each letter she wrote was seasoned with the same love and attention that had made her mother's meals memorable. "Mr. Redwood," she said softly, looking up from a letter she was writing to a widow in Miles City. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if I hadn't knocked on your door that day?" Jonas set aside his own correspondence, a proposal for establishing trade schools in frontier communities, and considered her question seriously. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "If you hadn't been brave enough to ask for help, if I hadn't been just barely human enough to let you in." He shook his head. "I don't like to imagine what would have happened to either of us." Annie rose from her desk and moved to sit beside Jonas on the comfortable sofa they'd chosen together, her head resting against his shoulder with the natural affection of a daughter, secure in her father's love. "I used to be scared that you might change your mind about keeping me," she confessed. "That when the money came through and everything got complicated, you might decide I was too much trouble." Jonas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, marveling at how natural the gesture had become after years of emotional isolation. Annie Mae, the day I decided to be your guardian wasn't about money or convenience. It was about love. The kind of love that doesn't change based on circumstances. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire crackle in the hearth and listening to the gentle sounds of children sleeping safely under their roof. On the mantelpiece, alongside the photograph of Jonas and Helena, sat a new family portrait, Jonas, Annie, and the 6 children currently living with them, all smiling with the confidence of people who knew they belonged somewhere. "There's something I want to show you," Annie said, reaching into her pocket to produce a small, wrapped package. "I've been working on it for weeks and I think it's finally ready." Jonas accepted the gift with curiosity, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a hand-carved wooden figure, not a doll this time, but a detailed miniature of a man teaching a group of children. The craftsmanship was remarkable for someone so young, showing both artistic talent and careful attention to detail. "It's you," Annie explained, her cheeks pink with nervous pride, teaching the children about responsibility and kindness and how to be strong when life gets difficult. "I wanted you to have something that showed how I see you, not as the scary man everyone used to fear, but as the best father anyone could ask for." Jonas felt tears prick his eyes as he studied the carving, recognizing in its loving detail the transformation that Annie had helped him achieve. The figure in the carving was confident and gentle, surrounded by children who looked up to him with trust and affection. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But Annie, you know the truth, don't you? You're the one who taught me how to be worth looking up to. You're the one who showed me that broken things can be made whole again." Annie smiled, settling back against his shoulder with the contentment of someone who had found her place in the world. "Maybe we taught each other." As the fire burned lower and the house settled into the peaceful quiet of a home filled with love and purpose, Jonas and Annie planned their next day's work: letters to answer, children to teach, and a foundation to build that would help families throughout the territory. Outside, the Montana wind carried the sense of approaching winter and the distant sounds of a growing community that had learned to measure wealth not in silver or gold, but in the strength of the bonds between people who chose to care for one another. The new family photograph on the mantelpiece seemed to smile in the firelight, capturing a moment of triumph over loss, of love conquering fear, and of 2 people who had discovered that the most precious inheritance isn't what you receive from the past, but what you create for the future. In the kitchen, Annie's mother's recipe book lay open to a page marked with careful handwriting. The secret ingredient in any recipe is love, but the secret to love is choosing to share it with everyone who hungers for it. And in the warm glow of their hearth, surrounded by the gentle breathing of sleeping children and the quiet satisfaction of work well done, Jonas Redwood and Annie Mae Fitzgerald had created exactly the kind of family that recipe was meant to feed. One built on generosity, seasoned with justice, and served with the unshakable faith that tomorrow would always be better than yesterday.